Hi everyone. Knuckliny Cracktano here, the internet's busiest music nerd. And it's time for a review of the new album from Jeffrey Lewis and the Deposit Returners, works by Tuli Kupferberg, 1923 to 2010. This is the latest full-length album from New York anti-folk veteran Jeffrey Lewis and his band, a man who has long been underappreciated in the New York music scene, and it's kind of understandable as to why, as Jeff's sound is not really for everybody. His voice, his guitar playing, the instruments he chooses to surround his songs in have a seasoned and yet very rickety quality to them that could only be honed through decades of going against the grain, and being greatly influenced by generations of artists who have done the same, pioneering raw forms of freaky folk and proto-punk. Just to name a very select few, the Velvet Underground, David Peel, Holy Modal Rounders, as well as a group by the name of the Fugs, who featured poet, cartoonist, songwriter Tuli Kupferberg, whose works are the basis of this very covers album right here. Tuli and the greater part of the 60s, 70s New York underground scene were introduced to me by Jeffrey himself about a decade ago with a captivating performance of poetry and music about a loose history of the scene's major songs and players and progressions, a lot of which is typically forgotten in favor of a lot of the big names to come out of punk rock in the late 70s, as if this movement and this genre of music just kind of came out of nowhere. But Jeffrey very much remembers and celebrates this lineage and embodies it in his music too, maybe more than any other anti-folk act to come out of New York in the late 90s or the 2000s, even when the scene was kind of peaking around 2007 when the Moldy Peaches were kind of dominating that hit Juno soundtrack. Now, while the songs on this record are in fact covers, for a lot of young listeners these might as well be originals, because Jeff has pulled some real obscurities out of the abyss on this one, as his renditions of these tracks are now like the first thing that pops up when you try to search for them. Plus, the way Jeffrey has updated and revised these songs, they play very nicely into his creaky nasal voice, his disheveled folk rock instrumentation, the somewhat out-of-tune guest singers. The only thing more raw than the sound of this album are the lyrics. Early on you can hear this is not an album that's going to take itself too seriously, and will address some very weird and awkward topics, especially considering the opening track is essentially about wanting to start a friendship with someone after an orgy. What are you going to do after the orgy? I wanna make friends with you after the orgy. The messy group vocals and kind of chaotic folk rock guitars on this one make groups like the Violent Femmes sound slick. And there's a good handful of other tracks on this thing that are equally absurd, like the track I Wanna Hold Your Foot, which is essentially a topical remix of the Beatles song I Wanna Hold Your Hand, but this new take on the song is for foot fetishists, complete with a little vocal break featuring some members of the band talking about what they feel is the sexiest part of the foot. And then there's one of my favorite cuts on this thing. This is a hit song. A rowdy, lo-fi punk rocker with distorted bass and jammin' piano chords, with these manic group vocals all chanting, "This is a hit song gonna make me rich. Why don't you buy it, you son of a bitch?" And being a New Yorker through and through, what would this Jeffrey Lewis album be without a plucky folk tune about the decaying New York City subway system? This train is bound for Brooklyn, also another catchy and supremely upbeat highlight on this thing. But one of the oddest cuts on this entire record has to be the song Hypothalamus, which is literally about the hypothalamus region of the brain. The instrumentation, the tune is very repetitive, very sour and odd, not all that catchy. Meanwhile, mixed in the chaos of the music is Jeffrey Lewis rattling off all of this encyclopedic knowledge of the hypothalamus. It is hilarious and informative. There are some more serious cuts on here that range from being joyful to addressing some of the worst sides of mankind, whether that be the song Try to Be Joyful, which seems almost like joy as an act of resistance in the face of a horrible and callous world. Also Love and Ashes, which is a chilling ballad set to what sounds like recordings of news broadcasts and speeches, with lyrics about dropping the atom bomb during World War II, war and death, and so on and so forth. And that is juxtaposed against love and marriage and people somehow, I guess, just finding a significant other in the midst of this world full of turmoil. However, the message of the song doesn't really seem like hopeful or inspiring or anything like that. It just merely seems like a very dark contrast. There are quite a few forlorn cuts on this record too, dealing in death and mortality and so on and so forth. And I get the sense that this album is also kind of a delayed send-off for Tuli by Jeffrey and his band, as he wasn't just simply an inspiration on Jeffrey's artistic works, written, sung, and drawn. Jeffrey also knew the man personally. So there is certainly an unshakable feeling on this record that when Jeffrey and his band are singing about things like life and death, mortality, it's done out of respect for Tuli's legacy and art, especially when Jeffrey can shift the focus or the lyrics on this album toward him, like on Life is Strange and Listen to the Mockingbird. Now, there are also some moodier, more low-key moments on this record that I think are essential for building out a quality, varied track list, but these songs also serve as some of the roughest listens on the entire record. And not for their lack of heart or emotion either, but in kind of keeping with the spirit of some of these very freaky folk tunes and the era of music Jeffrey is trying to emulate on this record, there are a lot of spots where him and the band will throw in these very freaky, goofy background vocals that honestly don't fly over that well, make the tracks difficult to listen to. They kind of sound like Brack from Space Ghost Coast to Coast, like wailing away in the background, especially on tracks like Carpe Diem or Seize the Day and I Was Much Mistaken, whose original version doesn't even really call for vocals like this. Yeah, unfortunately, that element of this record does really take me out of enjoying some parts of this record. It does. And I can understand the difficulties of trying to recreate the freakishness of some of those older records in the modern day, because some of that weird singing in a group came over in a smudgier recording, which I think gave you more leeway than these days when you're kind of, throwing vocals onto a digital multi-track. Generally, though, I did enjoy this album quite a bit. It's a pretty captivating set of funny and emotionally cutting renditions of the ripped, tattered, torn, lost, and ignored pages from the American Songbook. And even though there is some instrumentation and singing on this record that is a little too flimsy for me, simultaneously that also adds to the appeal of so many other tracks on this record, so I guess you win some, you lose some, it is what it is. I'm feeling a light to decent 7 on this thing. Transition, have you given this record a listen? Did you love it? Did you hate it? What would you rate it? You're the best, you're the best. What should I review next? Hit the like if you like. Please subscribe, and please don't cry. Hit the bell as well. Over here next to my head is another review for you to check out. Hit that up, or the link to subscribe to the channel. Anthony Fantano, Jeffrey Lewis, forever.